The Oregon seaboard is considered one of the most dangerous coastlines in the world. Since the early settlements of the 1800s, several hundred ships, both sail and steam, have left their damaged, debilitated vessels along the shore and taking many lives with them. The coast bar ports have been especially hazardous for ships to enter or leave, not only during stormy weather, but in fair weather too. And the Tillamook Bar is no exception. As early as 1870, there is record of the ship Millie Bond wrecking on a sandspit near the Tillamook Bar. None, however, would attract the attention of Oregonians more than the sinking of the Argo on November 26, 1909. This wreck would trigger a series of events that would ultimately lead to the Port of Bay City, which would one day become the Port of Garibaldi.
Well, the port was originally started in Bay City because they needed a north jetty. This was caused because of the sinking of the Argo in 1909. The Argo was a vessel of about 160 feet, and it was engaged in carrying products in and out of Tillamook. The Sue H. Elmore was a sister ship, and those two ships, before the railroad, they were the lifeline of Tillamook County. But then the Argo was crossing the bar, and it was picked up by a big wave and smashed down on the sandbars because the bar was shoaling.
Captain Robert Farley, based out of the recently formed Barview Life-Saving Station north of Garibaldi, launched out with his crew of surfmen to save the Argo and his passengers. Captain Farley would break his arm when the life-saving boat capsized. One of the lifesavers and 4 of the passengers were eventually drowned during the rescue.
That pointed up the need, and we'll find that in the history of the port, usually a crisis is what's needed in order to get some action.
With ocean-going vessels remaining the only practical means of importing supplies and exporting local cargoes of goods and lumbers throughout this period, it became essential for the livelihood of this community to try and remedy the rough Tillamook Bar. No one was more aware of the Tillamook Bar's impediment than Russell Hawkins. Mr. Hawkins was born in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in 1874. He began his career with the Diamond Match Company, becoming vice president and director. In 1907, Mr. Hawkins came to the Oregon country on behalf of the Whitney Lumber Company out of Detroit, Michigan. At the time, the Whitney Company held extensive timber holdings in the state. As the company's western manager, Hawkins estimated nearly 25 billion feet of high-grade timber was accessible through Tillamook Bay. Furthermore, Mr. Hawkins saw that Oregon's timber industry success and growth hinged on the Tillamook Bar's passage. By the time of the Argo sinking in 1909, it was evident that something had to be done. The bay would need large and expensive improvements. Jetties were determined to be necessary. Jetties, predominantly made of stone, extend from the shore into the sea to influence the current and to protect the harbor. Jetties would also deepen the Tillamook Bar crossing, which at low tide was only 7 feet deep, and to control sands which shifted across the entrance. It was determined a port must be developed to help initiate work on the bar and the jetty construction. Although the Port of Tillamook had been established in 1899, their jurisdiction was limited to the city limits of Tillamook and the Hochwharton Slough. Bay City was seen as a fitting spot logistically. It would be close enough to the bay's opening to warrant authority at the crossing. But it would also be in close proximity to the future railroad and the community's many timber operations. Bay City had been established in 1888 by Winfield S. Cone. For many years, this area was simply known as Down the Bay, with modest activity and enterprises. It would be promoted through early real estate brochures, however, as a major metropolis with its deep-water seaport and future railroad terminus. On February 3, 1909, the Oregon legislature had passed House Bill 28, an act which allowed the formation of the port districts by popular vote. A petition was filed with the Tillamook County Clerk on February 25, 1910, to incorporate the Port of Bay City. Voters approved the measure 63-16 during a special election by the county on April 27, 1910. The Port of Bay City was legally incorporated as a municipal corporation on May 4, 1910. Within a month, Russell Hawkins and the Whitney Company arranged a meeting with the Port of Tillamook Commission and the newly formed Port of Bay City Commission to discuss building the jetties with the Corps of Engineers. By July of 1910, both ports had resolved to pledge cooperation and funds to develop 2 jetties and dredging of the bar and bay. Russell Hawkins would negotiate the sale of bonds for both ports to help pay for the expenses. While some dredging work would begin immediately, it would take an additional 4 years before any construction would start on the jetty. In short, the Board of Engineers on Rivers and Harbors saw no benefits to dredging and creating jetties to justify its $2.2 million price tag, nor could the 2 ports afford their share of the project. A half-the-job plan would then be proposed by the ports, with only some in-bay dredging and only building a north jetty. The ports would cover half the expenditures. The Army Corps of Engineers warned that the action of a single jetty could not be foretold, likely providing only temporary relief. The work proceeded anyways. The North Jetty would be built off the beach of Barview. Rocks for the jetty were quarried near the Miami River and hauled by train 7 miles to the jetty. The 5,400-foot-long jetty would be completed in October of 1917, utilizing 429,000 tons of stone at a total construction cost of $766,000. In addition to Russell Hawkins, another businessman was anxiously watching the improvements to the Tillamook Bay. In 1906, T.B. Potter, a real estate promoter from Kansas City, purchased the spit situated between Tillamook Bay and the Pacific Ocean. Potter named the spit Bay Ocean and envisioned a millionaire's playground. Bay Ocean was promoted as the Atlantic City of the West. By 1914, 600 of the 3,000 lots had been sold to investors. A hotel with electricity and indoor plumbing was completed, along with a natatorium, dance hall, bowling alleys, and tennis courts. These improvements over the treacherous bar and into the bay would mean more tourists and prospective buyers for T.B. Potter's property.
Bay City was, at that time, a kind of a terminal to go over to Bay Ocean. Bay Ocean Peninsula at that time was difficult to get out to, and so that really put an impetus into the port of Bay City, because they didn't have a rail line or even a decent highway. And in fact, all through the history of the Tillamook Bay, the water transportation has been more successful than land transportation.
Ironically, the Bay Ocean's northern tip had been named Kincheloe Point. Julius Kincheloe was part of a 6-person U.S. Coast Guard survey team who were drowned in 1867 while surveying Tillamook Bay and its bar. This would be the first recorded death on the bar, and an ominous detail for Bay Ocean's future. It was near Bay Ocean that one of Tillamook Bay's most famous industries would be discovered. A Bay City plumber, Jesse Hayes, would find an oyster shell within the Corps of Engineers' dredge spoils, giving Mr. Hayes the gumption to create Oregon's first oyster farm. This business would be one of Port of Bay City's first success stories. Jesse Hayes would help make Tillamook Bay a leader in Oregon's oyster industry. He'd go on to excel in the crab fishing business too, exporting his crab all the way to San Francisco. The most profitable industry to ever exist along Tillamook Bay, however, was the timber industry. It was estimated that Oregon held 1/5 of the timber for the entire United States. Of that, Tillamook County held 20% of the state's timber. Although the timber was abundant, Tillamook County had transportation challenges faced by the area. Mills were closing because of shipping issues faced by the Tillamook Bar. Although most prime timber could eventually be moved by rail, low-grade timber was only profitable by moving through water transport, a detail that Russell Hodgkins and the Whitney Company knew well of. The Whitney Company initially began as a supplier to the Cummins-Mobley sawmill in Garibaldi. The tidelands around Tillamook Bay held large quantities of Sitka spruce, and Whitney owned much of it.
That sawmill in Garibaldi at one time was the largest sawmill in the state of Oregon, and it was designed primarily to cut the large spruce trees, and they used the spruce lumber in aircraft manufacturing. And they were shipping lumber out of the mill in Garibaldi by small lumber schooners. And the dredges kept the channel at 18 feet all the way to what was called the turning basin in front of the old Whitney mill.
In 1919, the Whitney Company purchased Cummins-Mobley and rebuilt a larger sawmill along the Tillamook Bay. Whitney's timber holdings were brought down the Kilchis River and dumped in the bay at Idaville, 2 miles south of Bay City. Almost all the logs arrived in Garibaldi from Idaville by raft. This was overseen by Henry Sauce Sr., the boom foreman. Henry Sauce Sr., who began his career in St. Paul, Minnesota, in the horse logging industry, eventually learned the open river driving of logs in Minnesota. He came to Oregon in the early 1900s and eventually began work for the Whitney Company.
My grandpa had a little towing business in Tillamook Bay, but it was only meant for towing rafts of logs around the bay. The loggers would come down to the Tillamook River to the Sauce log dump and offload the logs and put them in rafts. Grandpa would chug them right over to the mill where they were put in the pond to be scaled and graded before being made into lumber or plywood.
As the timber industry boomed and shipping through the bay and out over the bar increased, dredging of the bay became even more noticeable of a problem. The North Jetty also began to show wear, and in 1921, 500 more tons of rock would be used to shore up the structure. By 1931, monies would be finally allocated to fund the South Jetty project. However, by this time, the North Jetty would need even more significant repairs, and money for the South Jetty would be diverted back to the North Jetty. 320,000 tons of rock would be used to extend the jetty an additional 300 feet to 5,700 feet. Although the North Jetty improvements were welcomed by the many ships dependent on the bay's entrance, odd and irregular erosion began at 2 neighboring beaches. Shortly after the North Jetty began construction in 1914, the ocean had begun eroding and depleting much of Barview. This popular beach community, bordering on the jetty, began losing much of its sand and beach. The ocean eventually obliterated this once vibrant tourist destination. The storms even destroyed the home of Barview's Coast Guard, Captain Robert Farley. Throughout the 1920s, similar erosion was also noticeable at Bay Ocean. Yet, it wouldn't be until 1933, following the North Jetty's extension, that it became a major problem. The first structure to be undermined was the natatorium. Houses were challenged next. One resident calculated losing nearly 6 feet of land a year.
And we literally watched the old natatorium, especially, the foundation wash away, and it went down the bank. It was up on a hill and wash into the ocean. Well, I personally watched the buildings crumble and fall over the bank and down into the ocean and disappear.
The North Jetty would be blamed, as it had trapped an estimated 6 million cubic yards of sand to the north of the structure. These sands were prevented from reaching the spit and replenishing winter losses. By the 1940s, only 30 homes remained at Bay Ocean. As if erosion to Bay Ocean and Barview wasn't enough for Tillamook County to contend with, in 1933, the timber industry would take a major hit through a series of 4 forest fires known as the Tillamook Burn. The first fire began on August 14, 1933, at the Gales Creek Logging Company just west of Forest Grove. With unrelenting winds, dry heat, poor communication, and limited resources, the fire raged for nearly a month, destroying 300,000 acres of timber. In economic terms, 12 billion board feet of timber were destroyed, representing hundreds of jobs. The fires returned like clockwork every 6 years through 1951.
And when we would come to the beach, we would drive through all of those charred pieces, and it was very ugly. It looked like something out of a surreal mystery.
The fires were a major blow to the many lumber mills in and around Tillamook Bay. Fortunately for Russell Hopkins and the Whitney Company, they had sold out the Garibaldi mill in April of 1927 to the Hammond-Tillamook Lumber Company. Hammond-Tillamook Lumber Company would close in 1934 after the first fire. Henry Sauce Sr. saw a new opportunity with the salvage timber. Following the first Tillamook burn, there began heavy salvage logging work. Money was being made salvaging what usable timber could be found. In 1938, this activity created the basis for Henry Sauce's new company with his son Curtis.
All of that timber, which at that point in time you'd call salvage timber, became available, so there's a tremendous amount of logs available out of the Bay Area there. And mills at Warrington and up in Grays Harbor, Aberdeen, they were looking for some of that timber, and that was the beginning of Sauce Brothers Ocean Towing.
The Tillamook burn would greatly affect Tillamook Bay through the silting caused from the 4 burns.
That was a pretty hot burn, you know, and it burned so much brush off the ground, and there was so much water, lots of rain and creeks running everywhere. And so naturally, just mud created from everywhere was running into the bay in all 5 rivers all the time. And sometimes when there was a good rainstorm and there was a lot of high water running, the whole bay was just brown.
The bay, being fed by 5 rivers, the Miami, Kilchis, Wilson, Trask, and Tillamook, would send charred sediment into the bay.
Once you lost all that ground cover up there, a lot of silting came down. Those rivers, the Wilson River, the Kilchis, the Trask, they looked like coffee during the winter. The bay was so shallow, the channels that when you tow those log rafts down to Garibaldi, you'd use a descending tide. So by the time you got down there and got your rafts delivered, the logs delivered, then the tide would be too low to get back up to the river.
Originally that was a channel all the way to Bay City, and they dredged to Bay City for a while before my time on the port. And they came along and said, you know, there's no need, you can't prove where you need channel, no cargo, no ships moving up there. They unauthorized that channel from Garibaldi to Bay City.
The channel to Bay City would eventually be unfunded, putting pressure on a new boat basin. This would push the activity of the port of Bay City north to its current site in Garibaldi.
And so eventually, since the port of Bay City was not eligible for federal dredging, and it would have to be done independently, which is very expensive, they decided to move the port of Bay City to the port of Garibaldi as an official location.
But during the early 40s, the port started working on trying to get a boat basin, and to be frank about it, the Garibaldi boat basin was originally built by Tillamook County out of Tillamook County road funds.
And the county did a lot of work for the port. in helping to build this boat base. And I was just a little kid then. I was in grade school, I think. And I know another kid and I, Billy Hoy, we were watching them build the boat base, and we thought it was really neat.
As a matter of fact, my father built the first dock. He and a man called Harold Jones, who also built a fish plant there, built their own. They rented the property from Tillamook County and built the fish plants in the boat basin at Garibaldi.
So all this happened in 1941, and it really, for the first time in Tillamook Bay, gave the commercial fishermen a home port. And that's where we kind of go for the next 70 years as far as the commercial fisheries in Tillamook.
The county was not giving the Port of Bay City, they found out some of the tax money that they were supposed to be giving the Port of Bay City for many, many years. And the Port of Bay City decided they were going to sue Tillamook County to collect the back taxes that hadn't been paid, so a compromise was made. County said to the port, we'll give you the Garibaldi boat basin if you'll forget the lawsuit, and a compromise was made. So the Port of Bay City then took over ownership of the Garibaldi boat basin and has run it ever since.
That period also really allowed the port ultimately to diversify the business units that it was involved in. Prior to the boat base in 1941 in the early 50s, the port was primarily a funder for jetty construction and dredging projects. When the county came into the marina, they ultimately weren't going to run the marina, and they contracted with the port to do a lot of the administrative functions of that. So that was really a new business unit for the port. When the port came into possession of that property in the 50s, all of a sudden they became property managers. And so I think that those were pretty significant changes in the business units that the port undertakes, and to this day, the vast majority of our energy goes into managing the marina and managing our property.
By the 1950s, little of Bay Ocean was left, though the final straw came in November of 1952. A storm broke through the spit, severing it from the mainland. Although the sea had broken through in 1939, this time the gap was quite significant.
It came through and wiped out a lot of the boats, and it was destroying the oyster beds because the sand was pouring through there. And there was a pretty deep channel in there, in that breakthrough. While they were processing that breakthrough, my father, just to prove to him what it was like, my dad took one of his commercial fishing boats out and made a circle down the coast and came in through that breakwater with one of his commercial fishing boats and on down to Garibaldi. But it would have completely wiped out the oyster industry, no doubt about that. And it was washing silt from the beaches into the bay.
It would be years before a dike would be installed, destroying much of the bay shellfish industry and furthering the silting issue. Having lost nearly 1,900 feet between 1933 to 1955, the North Jetty would be built back to 4,100 feet in 1955. In July of 1958, additional dredging would also take place, this time around the boat basin, further expanding the port's operation.
And they came in and dredged out about doubling the size of what the original boat basin was. They pumped it out and filled the sand beach where the motel's at and so forth. And then the port has just been slowly expanding it ever since.
With the breakthrough of Bay Ocean, continuous repairs to the North Jetty, and the constant dredging of the bay, the Port of Bay City would refocus its efforts to finally build the South Jetty.
This was the main thing of the whole, in the whole world, was the South Jetty, because they knew that the South Jetty was a real necessity to making the harbor a little more safe place to go in and out of, because of the fact that without a South Jetty, the bar was just, there was days after days that you couldn't cross the bar because it was just rough all the time.
I actively started working on the South Jetty project in 1958, and I'm pretty sure it was in 1958 that we hired a consultant called Tom Murray from Portland. And Tom Murray did an absolute excellent job for the county and the port in helping work our way through the congressional delegation to get funding for that South Jetty. It was a joint project between the Port of Bay City, Tillamook County, and the Port of Tillamook Bay. And we got together, and when the design was finished, it was completed by the Portland District. The design came up, and the blueprints for the jetties to be 2,000 feet apart. And we knew as operators that in the history of other jetties up and down the coast, 2,000 feet would be absolutely useless to the local people. And Senator Hatfield got money, if I remember right, at that time it was around $1 million, which was a lot of money, to finance a model at the Waterways Experiment Station in Vicksburg, Mississippi. And they built the model, which you have pictures of. And this thing covered about close to an acre of land under roof, where they ran the model. And as I mentioned before, they used small styrofoam pellets to see where the current was moving in the bay, out of the 5 rivers, down out through the channel. And then they had dye markers that showed you where the silt went. And they, with the model, they built a model with different widths and came out with the ultimate design would be 1,000 feet apart between the South Jetty and the North Jetty, which made us happy, but they compromised a little bit with the Portland District, and the jetties, I'm sure, were 1,200 feet apart is what they are right now. And we were pleased with just narrowing it down from 2,000 feet. And then it was a constant battle to get financing to build the jetties. And they finally built it, but they ran out of money before they got it clear out to where it was authorized to be built. And I said, we don't have money to do anymore. And then it was quite a long time before we got them to finance the rest of it. And they came down and lengthened the South Jetty out to what the design was intended to be in the first place. And I had promised the port I would quit when it was done. So the next meeting I resigned.
The end of the timber industry, as Garibaldi knew it, would conclude in the 1970s. The original mill built by the Whitney Company had changed hands countless times through the 1940s until becoming the Oregon Washington Plywood Plant, makers of Loctite plywood. Environmental concerns of the mill's smokestack would eventually close the plant in 1974. Later, some former employees tried to get the mill operating again.
The huge silent mill sits motionless on Tillamook Bay, its machinery rusting with plumeless smokestacks. But at least 100 former mill workers have banded together to try to reopen the place as a cooperative plywood manufacturer. They think they can sell the plywood and say they can get the logs, while the trickiest part is to raise the money.
A couple years after the Oregon-Washington mill closed, Jerry Creasy and George Smith bought the property lock, stock, and barrel. A marina and RV park would be developed. It was a sign of the times, as Garibaldi no longer sought old-growth Sitka spruce and now catered towards retirees and tourists. This would also be the final bow for the Sauce family in Garibaldi. Having worked the bay for half a century, they would now call Coos Bay their headquarters.
The mill went through another closure period, cutting off the supply of materials to be hauled out of here, and the company looked around and decided that they needed a bar with a deeper draft than is available or could be made available in Garibaldi, and began to make plans to move the operation to Coos Bay.
Though with the closing of the timber industry, a new door opened for the port.
The boom times for the port was largely the fishing in the 70s, and especially the shrimp fishing. And that's when we had like 7 shrimp picking machines.
Bill Smith and Billy Schreiber's father came in and built the first shrimp plant that was done in Garibaldi. His uncle was one of the premier shrimp processors. He had started in Alaska and came to Garibaldi.
In 1973, when I got here, we bought the building from Sauce's and leased that ground, and then we finished Olson Oyster Company's Ford building, actually built a building to process our shrimp in. And so the Sauce Brothers building was our office, warehouse, and chill room. We had a small ice plant in there also, and then the Olson Oyster building is where we actually had our cooker peelers and our boilers and our coffee rooms and our processing facility.
Bill Smith was the one that basically came in and convinced people that it was financially feasible to catch those shrimp and process them and make a living out of it.
And he was dynamic. He was one of the real founding fathers of the seafood industry in Garibaldi, and we would call the radio station, KTIL, and they would put an announcement over the air that Smith Pacific Shrimp Company would be working tomorrow. And then the next day, then we would have as many as 100 or so hand-picked ladies would come in, and we would hand-pick the shrimp, and they would do that for 12 hours a day, 7 days a week.
Boy, there was a lot of shrimp coming in. Those big shrimp boats were coming in, and there was one unloading almost all the time. It was kind of a big thing, all right. Kept the boat basin pretty busy.
Seafood industry before Smith Pacific Shrimp came to town wasn't real large. There was no shrimp, and that was the heyday. That's when brought a lot of revenue. When my father and my uncle came to town, they really changed the face of the community, I think, especially the boat basin.
The charter boat businesses along the boat basin also soared. The industry was led by the Vanderkoevering family. Trawler charters by 1989 would employ 8 boats and would be responsible for nearly 1/2 the charter fishing trips leaving the port.
Dad started really with little or nothing, and he was able to succeed in the fishing business. Not without sacrifices, of course, but it was a lot of hard work. But my dad loved the sea. He was a captain for about 40 years. It is sport fishing, and the personality of the captain and crew really makes for a good day. And I do know that, I don't know, there's always the fish stories, and it's entertaining. I mean, my dad too, as with every fisherman, how big is the fish, and it gets, or you should have been here yesterday, but Dad was just a great character, yeah.
The morning begins gray and cool. a little unexpected for the early part of the coho or silver salmon season. We are on board the trawler's charter boat Big G with skipper Larry Van de Koevering, on our way out of Tillamook Bay at Garibaldi. The town of Garibaldi is located in the central coastal area of Oregon, named for an Italian patriot and founded in the 1850s. Today, this is one of Oregon's most popular sports fishing communities.
As the port's popularity grew and demand for boat and commercial space increased, the port faced a new set of challenges left over from the former generation of port management. The old ways of the past had to be corrected and modernized. The 1990s would see a new form of management at the port that would tackle the many issues and help steer it into the 21st century, including the renaming of the port.
Well, it was pretty much a port that was thought of as being a local port, that the people here basically, they had built it and they owned most everything here, and that the port was really their facility. The rents hadn't been increased, so when I was brought in, I was kind of charged to do all that. We started getting things improved and started to get the new roads and get everything paved. At one time there was very little paving, and it looked like a sandstorm in the afternoon. And the boats that were in the harbor were just covered with sand after a bad storm.
And so one of the neatest things was that he eliminated all the dust that was not good for, you know, the seafood processing and all that kind of stuff. But we've rebuilt the boat basin a few times, and the last time we did it was about 3 years ago, and we literally removed all the boats out of the boat basin, dredged it out, and then rebuilt all the docks back and made that a much better place.
And then we had no filtering of the water. It was just running out into the bay. The harbor had problems where they were just dumping oil in the bay. When the guys changed their boat oil, they just dump it overboard. We corrected all of that, and the whole facility cleaned up very nicely.
If you look at the financial side of the Port of Garibaldi, we're managed very well, and we're handling the port economically, but yet we're progressing.
This is a peculiar port. It never had to go broke in the bad times, and it's always had been managed well, had lots of money to operate with, and it does well. And I think the people who come down here to fish really do appreciate the port and the facilities that are offered.
But why it was still called the Port of Bay City is because nobody figured it was necessary to change the name, I guess.
They wanted to rename it Port of Garibaldi, a lot of people, while I was working there, but the port commissioners said, we can see no reason to change the name of it. It's been Port of Bay City since 1910. Why change the name of it now? But after I left, they did change the name of it.
They thought it would be a good idea to name the port, rename the port, to express where the main facilities were located. A few people said, well, you know, why do you have to do that? It's an expense, but it wasn't that much. So we went ahead and did it, and it took about a year, and we changed the name to Port of Garibaldi, and it basically reflects where the activity is for the port.
The new century would include an old familiar problem with the sinking of the Tacky 2 in June of 2003.
Tacky 2, of course, was a terrible accident. It was Father's Day. A couple of charter boats decided not to go across the bar, but there was 4 of them that did, and they were all loaded with folks. And 3 of them got across the bar, and there was a 13-foot exchange that day.
The vessel, as it was transiting across the bar, was hit by a wave broadside and capsized immediately.
The 32-foot fishing boat was first discovered lying upside down. The Coast Guard says waves were as high as 16 feet.
Just the risk they take every time they jump the bar like that, and it's a high risk.
He's a good skipper, and he just got caught. The bar is real unpredictable.
Of the 19 folks that went in the water, 11 of them died, and of the 11 that died, we knew 7 of them. They were our customers and our friends. And so that was the worst one that happened, but there's been a lot of individual accidents, and there's been as many as 3 folks on the bar that have died that I remember in one accident. And so, yeah, I'd hate to start counting them up, but I'm sure 25 or 30 folks have passed away crossing that bar that I'm aware of.
And as a result, to make a living, you went out sometimes when you shouldn't go out. Some of them are inexperience, some of them are just pure accidents. There was a lot of fatalities, and there still are.
You may have noticed them rolling through Portland and down along Highway 26, massive boulders chained onto semi-trucks. Well, many say those rocks are the key to saving our coastal economy. News Channel 8's environmental reporter Keely Chalmers is live at the Tillamook Bay Jetty where those rocks are headed. Keely?
Yeah, Tracy, already about 640-ton boulders have been stockpiled here at the base of the jetty, and more are coming in every day, carried one by one on semis, traveling some 350 miles from quarries in Washington. The rocks will be stored here until June when work to rebuild the North Tillamook Bay Jetty begins. About 350 feet of the jetty has deteriorated, making the channel in and out of Garibaldi's harbor treacherous at times. Since 1992, 20 people have died near the Tillamook Bar. 13 of those perished when the Tacky 2 charter boat capsized back in June of 2003. Fishermen say this jetty repair is vital for their safety and for the coastal economy.
The jetty is important because if that were not maintained, there would be no commerce with boats coming in and out that was possible. The skippers didn't like to come over that bar, but with and there never has been a bar built along the coast that I know of that didn't get worked over by the ocean and needed repair. And it wasn't something you could just build and it was there for good.
The bar is still not a good bar. It's a difficult bar to get across. It's not the deepest thing for deep draft vessels. It's not a good one. It doesn't flush out very well. In other words, it doesn't get deep. You have a hump in it right out at the jetties, at the tip of the jetties and beyond the jetties. And every time I look at it, it seems like that the entrance has moved from the south to the north. There's a little hole through at the north. You never know where you're going to, it doesn't appear to me that you're ever going to know for certain where the channel to deep water is going to be.
Every year we lose more and more feet off the end of the jetties, the south jetty and the north jetty. One has lost 700 feet and the other one has lost 400 feet, and it makes it really extremely dangerous to cross the bar. Plus we have an area out in the front grounds that is shoaling up, and so you have a possibility of having a breaker just almost come out of nowhere. And so we've got all these sport fishermen and commercial guys that are crossing the bar. Like I say, it gets worse every year. So we now have acquired enough money to repair the North Jetty, and the North Jetty rocks are being brought in right now as we speak, 35 to 50-ton boulders, one boulder per truck, and I think we need 1,000 of those. And they're going to start placing those jetty rock, I believe, in August.
And it's really amazing because once all that rock is being placed, and as we speak right now, about 99% of the rock is there. Of the 1,100 rocks, just under that is in place here in 2010. And there's a lot of discretion on the crane operator as to which rocks to use in placing them on the jetty. So he kind of knows which piles have which quality of rock, and so he takes the discretion of picking the one that's going to best get the job done.
This time, they are using bigger and more dense rocks than have ever been used before. Many people in the community have been concerned because we did use a local quarry. Local quarries have been used in the past, but the Corps has determined that the rock, in order to withstand the weather and the pressures we have here in Garibaldi, needed to be much denser than previously. So they don't get much denser than the ones that we've got. And it's purported to last for 50 years.
So I believe if the North Jetty, the work they're doing now, it ought to be there for another 30, 40, 50 years. But there again, it's if the ocean goes up, raises 2 or 3 feet, it's going to overwhelm the jetty, the water level. So who knows what's going to happen.
The Port of Garibaldi has been the epicenter to an Oregon story like few others. One might ask then, how could the Port of Garibaldi's next 100 years be any more challenging and intricate as the last 100 years? Although any local would speculate, how couldn't it?
Let's bow our heads together. Father in heaven, we come to you. We realize that this is much more than just a pole that stands in the air, but it holds those things that mean a lot to us. The freedom that we enjoy in this land, the privilege of the free enterprise system where men can start and run a business and be successful, can have enterprise and benefit a community. We're thankful for their memory. We're thankful for all of these things, and we ask your blessings that we may continue to live in this peace and freedom that we enjoy in this land. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you. I had an opportunity to interview about 20 or so local individuals that were seafood related. Could be dock workers, could be someone that worked in a restaurant that served seafood to fishermen. I interviewed captains, back deckmen, and one of the last question that I asked each one of these individuals was, what would you like to see Garibaldi be like? And one of the captains said he would like to see it the way it was when it was bustling, and I would like to think I would like to see the same thing. I'd like to see many big boats coming and going. I'd like to see a lot of seafood processing plants. I'd like to see a lot of revenue, a lot of employment, and just overall, make Garibaldi a real bustling city again.
I think that even though the timber industry may have gone away and even the commercial fishing has maybe taken a back seat, when you look at what Garibaldi and what Tillamook County has is this wonderful visual place. I mean, the natural resources, the bay, the ocean, the mountains, that's always going to be there. And I think that what we're looking in the next 100 years is really, how can we diversify the things that we're doing that really takes that into account.
And I think developing tourism is really important. I think at the same time, we would like to develop our beautiful water view property in a way that makes it more attractive and more marketable for people who would like to have a view of the water. We're thinking that if we do some development, we could have shops on the lower stories and offices or residents above that.
Fishing will remain. I believe it'll always be a good fishing port. The interest to that to the bay is problematic during the winter, but I believe the fishing will remain. Sport fishing, tourist type business also, but I don't see any big moves to commercialize it any further than what it is right now.
probably going to be almost strictly tourism and sporting industry. The commercial fishing industry, with the technology nowadays that the boats have of finding fish and catching them, the larger boats have taken over the industry, and I just don't see any future in Garibaldi in the seafood processing.
One of the other really nice renewable energy concepts that have been rolling around are the wave energy proposals, and the Port Commission has been looking at some opportunities to maybe add some wave energy generation on the tips of the jetties, north and south jetties. And I think that's a real pretty acceptable approach for the fishermen, because it doesn't necessarily add anything to their footprint. So it kind of stays out of their way because it's along the jetty. And so I think it's going to be those types of things, those types of economic development opportunity. And I think this is really going to take us into the next century and far beyond that.
You know, we do have the luxury of having the bay itself there versus like other coastal towns. So there is room for development. As far as the fisheries and the state regulations, I don't think that, you know, the volume of fish isn't there, number one, and then the restrictions. But like my father, you know, quoting him, he said, as long as there's one fish out there, somebody's going to want to go catch it.